I know it's been a while since I made a video on my SR rebuild series. For those of you guys who are new, this is a series I started to document the process of rebuilding my SR. And it's a series I started not only because I personally love watching the process of rebuilding these motors, but because I wanted to share the steps I'm going to be taking, which are different than what might be online already. The point of this video is not only to give an update on all the pieces I collected for the rebuild, but also to go over why I purchased what I did. And for those of you that are following along with maybe an SR rebuild of your own, or you're rebuilding a motor, I'm going to go through areas that if you want to make a more affordable setup, you could change things up and do that. Or if you want to go crazier than me and overbuild it and handle more power, I'll show where you can upgrade and do that. But yeah, the point of this video is just to go over everything I purchased over the course of maybe 6 months since the last video. I'm not really sure. And I know a lot of you guys are going to be wondering if I'm going to be rebuilding the motor on my own, and sadly the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is just because I put a lot of money into all the pieces for this rebuild, and although I do think I am capable enough to try to attempt to rebuild this motor, it is not something I'm comfortable doing right now with my entire net worth being in front of me and risking losing it all. So yeah, I'm going to have someone else rebuild the motor and we will show that after this, but the point of this video again is just to go over everything that I purchased and why. So to start, we're going to go through the bottom end. So before getting into the specifics of brands and different types of pistons there are, I wanted to go into the compression ratio and size of piston I decided to go with. So starting with size, I decided to go with the 86.5 millimeter piston. The stock piston size of an S-Star is 86 millimeter. The reason I decided to go with 86.5 versus a 87 or bigger, or even a 90 millimeter piston, is because I want to keep it as small as possible while maintaining the factory sleeves. I do not plan on sleeving this block unless I need to, and I do not feel comfortable running a 87.5, 88 millimeter piston on stock sleeves because it makes it really thin and it could make it prone to break. So yeah, I decided to go with 86.5 millimeter. I know a lot of you guys are probably wondering, you didn't do the machine work. Why did you buy 86.5 millimeter pistons? You're supposed to wait until the machine work is done to make sure that all the imperfections in the cylinder are removed before you buy your pistons. My thought process was more like, if I cannot fit an 86.5 millimeter piston on the stock sleeves, then I am going to sleeve the block, but I'm hoping that with just a 0.5 millimeter overbore that it'll be fine. But yeah, that's why I decided to go with 86.5 millimeters. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with buying pistons before machine work, but that's just how I decided to do it and why. And next I'm going to go on to compression ratios. The stock compression ratio of an SR20 is 8 to 5 to 1. I did not want to up the compression like most people would to maybe 9 to 1 or even higher like an NA application. And the reason behind that is because if you were to look at my old pistons, which I showed in the previous videos, you would see a bunch of detonation around the cylinders. What I was running for fuel is 91 octane, which is the highest I can get here in Northern California. And I would also sometimes put octane boosters in that to try to mitigate detonation, but I still was detonating like crazy. When you up the compression of your motor, it actually makes it more prone to detonation, and so I didn't feel comfortable already experiencing detonation on the fuel and compression ratio I was on, putting a higher compression piston. So I decided to stick with the same factory 80 or 8 to 5 to 1 compression, and yeah. Next, I'm going to move on to which pistons I decided to go with. So this is where there's going to be a lot of debate too. Basically, the entire rebuild of an SR, people are going to say you're doing something wrong no matter what you do. I decided to do my own research. If you're building a motor yourself, I suggest you do your own. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. This is just the conclusions I came up to. And a lot of them, my engine builder didn't even agree with. But it's just what I wanted to do, you know. And it's my motor. I decided to go with CP Carrillo pistons, and the reason behind that is because if you guys do any form of research onto Nissan manufacturing for the aftermarket, you will find that CP is very reputable. I know a lot of people will recommend uh, Manly or any of those other brands. What I came to the conclusion of from doing some basic research, because I'm not an engine building person, is that CP does a really good job in the manufacturing process with their forging. And also I really like that versus other pistons I looked at, they don't have any like loose metal, or I forgot the term for it. It's just like strains in their casting or forging. And I also like that they're all balanced within 1 gram of each other versus other pistons. If you buy them, you will have to balance them. If you want a balanced like rotating assembly, CP has that done out of the box. The only issue with CP pistons is they don't come factory coated, which other pistons have that on top. But they do also offer a service that if you want to coat them, you can. I decided not to. I'm not sure why. I just didn't decide not to. But yeah, if you guys are also into SR20s, you would know about Nitto, which is a company that uses CP pistons, but they modify it in their own way, kind of like Mazworks main studs versus ARP main studs. They just like change things up to make it more functional for that application. The thing that Nitto does is they do upgraded wrist pins that are thicker, such as these, versus the factory one. And another item they do to differentiate themselves from a traditional CP piston is they do PVD coated rings, and they do anti-detonation grooves on the top of the piston. I copied 2 out of 3 of those. I did the upgraded wrist pin, which CP does offer as an additional part. So I did purchase the additional or the upgraded wrist pin, which will make the motor capable of handling not just more power per cylinder, but more shock, which is the main reason I bought it. And then I also did PVD coat the rings. But yeah, that's why I decided to go with CP pistons and not Nitto and not Manly, not any of the other brands. And yeah, start your debates. So moving on from the pistons, I did decide to get aftermarket rod as well. At my power levels, I probably would have been fine running the stock rods, but the reason I decided to change them out is because if I ever want to make more power in the future, I don't want to be limited. This is an area that if you're just rebuilding your motor, you could probably get away with using the stock DET rods. They're plenty strong, and actually the fact that they have some like resist or forgiveness to them could be beneficial to some people. But for rods, I decided to go with a Brian Crower 625 Plus rod. The only difference between this and a traditional Brian Crower rod is they upgrade the hardware for the main cap or for the rod caps to a ARP 625 Plus hardware, which just makes it able to withstand more pressures, and you could actually torque them down even tighter. The traditional BC rod, I think, uses an ARP 2000 fastener, which is plenty strong. There was honestly no reason for me to upgrade the hardware. I just decided to do it because I was there. That's another area that if you wanted to save some money, you could. And also, if you wanted to go crazier, you could. If you wanted to, you could upgrade to like a Carrillo rod, but you would be spending a significant amount more, but it is a lot better. I just decided to go with the middle of the line BC with a 625 upgrade. So moving on from the pistons and rods, where I'm pretty sure I sparked a pretty big debate because a lot of people are opinionated with things like this, I'm going to move on to the bearings, which are also in the bottom end. And for the main bearings, the rod bearings, and the thrust bearings, I decided to go with ACL bearings, but these aren't traditional ACL bearings. I noticed one night when I was looking on Mazworks' website, they offer a service where they either, I'm not sure if you pronounce it Calico or Calico, coat the bearings to make them more wear resistant, and I kind of like the idea, so I decided to go with the Calico or Calico coating for all the bearings. These bearings are standard size bearings. I know I'm probably going to need the bigger size bearings in addition to the standard size ones, so I'll order that when the guy who's assembling the bottom end is going to yell at me and say, hey, buy these bearings, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. The theme you guys are going to notice with this entire rebuild is that I'm overbuilding everything to the best of my ability, and my reasoning behind that is the concept I'm sticking with is the more you overbuild something, the less stress everything is under. So just with that concept in mind, I'm deciding to build everything to the most of my ability, besides sleeving the block, because that's out of budget. So keeping on with the theme of overbuilding this motor to make it as reliable as possible, the next things I'm going to go over are all areas that I decided to overbuild the motor just to, in concept, have a more reliable motor. We'll see if that's true or not. But yeah, for the machine work, I decided to purchase a MassWorks SR20 torque plate. And what this is designed to do is to simulate having the head bolted onto the block for machine work for when you're honing the cylinders through here, or for when you're setting the ring gaps on the piston. And the reason behind that is you really want to use a torque plate on aluminum blocks such as SR20s, because when you bolt the head to them, they actually compress. And so if you bore out the cylinder without simulating having the head on it, you would have areas that are kind of like this in the cylinder. So when you're setting your ring gaps or when you're finally running the motor, there are areas that the ring could be compressing and contracting, which is just overwearing everything. So I decided to purchase a MassWorks torque plate. I know a lot of other companies make torque plates such as PRP and some other companies, but the reason I decided to go with the MassWorks one is, one, I placed a giant order on MassWorks website. Two, I didn't like that the other torque plates don't have the spacer piece built into them. Instead, they have like a little spacer you need to put on. To me, this just being one piece and nice and made from a reputable company made me really want to run it. And I know a lot of you guys are probably wondering, if you're outsourcing the machine work and assembly of the bottom end to someone who's supposed to be reputable, why do they not own an SR20 torque plate? The reason behind that is majority of the motors they build are KAs. I know a lot of people's red flags are going crazy right now. They're thinking, why am I sending my motor off to someone who specializes in a different type of motor? I'm gonna get back to that. But the main reason I decided to buy this torque plate is the person who's assembling my SR normally rents SR20 torque plates, but we were unable to get that this time. So rather than trying to hunt down a rental, I decided just to buy one. And then in addition to having the torque plate, I decided to buy not one, but two head gaskets, because when you are attaching a torque plate to the block, you don't want to just go like straight metal to metal, because you are going to be scratching the surfaces of the block and the torque plate. So for final assembly, I decided to go with the Apex 88 millimeter for the cylinder, 1.2 millimeter thick head gasket. This is the head gasket I decided to go with just because I think Apex makes the best head gaskets for SR20s. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that. I know a lot of people might agree with that, but this is just what I wanted to go with, so I decided to go with. But because these are really expensive, I decided to buy a Tomei 88 millimeter, 1.2 millimeter head gasket for the machining process, because I'm pretty sure this is going to get pretty messed up during that. And I didn't want to buy two expensive head gaskets. The reason I decided to go with the 1.2 millimeter head gasket is because it keeps the compression ratio factory, which I wanted to do. The thicker you go with the head gasket, the lower your the less your compression ratio is, and the thinner you go, the more your compression ratio is. I already had problems with detonations, as I explained with the pistons, so I didn't want to like change it to make it lower or higher, and I do not want to mess with the compression ratio. The reason I decided to go with the 88 millimeter for the bore of the head gasket is because I'm going to be running a 86.5 millimeter piston. And if you go on any website ever for head gaskets, they all tell you make sure that you buy a head gasket that is at least 1 millimeter bigger than your bore. So if you're buying a head gasket for an 86 millimeter build, make sure you don't buy an 86 millimeter head gasket, because you will have issues. And also don't go too big. The ideal number is to have a 1 millimeter bigger head gasket than your bore, but they don't make a 87.5 millimeter for Tomei or Apex. I decided to go with the 88. Now for hardware. I decided to go with MassWorks hardware for both the main studs and the head studs, and the reasoning behind that is factory main studs are perfectly fine to use. But again, I'm sticking with the concept of overbuild and have everything have less stress. And one thing that is constantly under stress, especially in a drifting application, is your main studs, because they could stretch, and then that's when your bearings like to loop around. So I decided to go with MazWorks for the main studs. I decided to go with MazWorks over ARP because I heard nightmare like stories of people threading ARP main studs and head studs and them not going deep enough to the point that when they go to tighten it, it strips the threads. So I didn't want to risk that. I decided to just upgrade to MazWorks main studs and head studs. And yeah, I highly recommend not running stock head studs if you're going to be upping the boost or just in general. I don't believe they're strong enough. They do stretch, and at the bare minimum, I highly recommend upgrading your head studs either to ARP or MazWorks, whatever you feel comfortable doing. And you can run stock main studs if you are on a tighter budget. So that is everything for the bottom end. Now I'm going to be transitioning into what I'm going to be running for the head and everything I'm going to be refreshing and upgrading. But before that, I wanted to talk about this. This is a MazWorks freeze and oil port plug kit. I decided to purchase this because I believe if you're doing any sort of machine work, you want to remove all your freeze plugs and your oil port plugs to make sure you get everything clean and get all the debris, metal shavings, dirt, all out of everything, because any of that remains in your motor could destroy your motor. So I highly recommend taking all that out. And I just purchased MazWorks OEM style kit, but the only thing that I will have to do additional is retap all the threads to NPT because I believe that the factory ones aren't NPT. I know MazWorks makes a really cool threaded kit, but you can only get that if you have your motor built by MazWorks, and that is completely out of my budget, so we're sticking with the OEM style kit. But yeah, for the head. For the cams, I decided to go with Tomei Pong cams. These are a drop-in cam, and if I wanted to, I could run the factory valve springs with them. But these are a 256 for the exhaust and intake side versus a stock 248, I believe. Don't quote me on that. The reason I decided to go with Tomei is because they are very reputable and I really like their products. So I decided to go with Tomei Pong cams for the cams, and I decided to go with Tomei Step 1 valve springs, which are just a little bit stiffer than stock, but it is the perfect match for their Pong cams. They designed both these products in conjunction with each other, so they are made to work perfectly with each other. They have good harmonics and they won't have valve float. Valve float, for anyone curious, is just when the spring is compressing so fast that it makes it unbalanced and you will have an issue with your valve train in the very basic form. If you want a detailed explanation of what valve float is, I highly recommend watching a Real Street video on it. They did a really good job of explaining that, but they did it in a lot longer than 30 seconds. In addition to the Tomei valve springs and the Pong cams, I decided to go with Tomei's valve guides. If you're rebuilding an SR, it's 30 years old. You need to keep that in mind. So I decided to replace the valve guides. I'm guaranteed the valve guides in my head are completely worn out and the valves have a bunch of like play in them. You don't want any play in your valves. So I decided to go with Tomei standard valve guides. And I also decided to change out my oil squirters with brand new Nissan ones. And the reason behind that is, yes, I could clean the oil squirters for the head out and reuse them, but they're cheap enough that I decided just to purchase new ones and know that they're 100%. So now the issue with Tomei. I know a lot of you guys probably are aware of this, but there are some that aren't, like I was. There is a big difference between Tomei Japan and Tomei USA. When I originally purchased all the head stuff for my motor, I purchased everything in the US, and it was actually Tomei USA, which you can tell the difference between a Tomei USA product and a Tomei Japan product because when you look at the part number, when you look at the part number, which you guys will be unable to see here, on a Tomei Japan product, it starts with numbers versus a Tomei USA product, it always starts with the letter T. And if you go on Tomei Japan's website, they have a blog where they mention that in 2019, Tomei USA and Tomei Japan basically split and they are no longer related. And the reasoning behind that is Tomei Japan pretty much figured out that Tomei USA was manufacturing their products not to Tomei Japan's standards. So their partnership had already ended and they figured out that basically Tomei USA is using different manufacturers for their products, which sometimes are worse. So I decided to go with Tomei Japan for all these products. I believe I probably would have been fine using Tomei USA products, but just knowing that Tomei Japan is no longer related to Tomei USA just left like a bad taste in my mouth. So I decided to support the true company that developed these parts rather than the company that bought the licensing and is trying to profit on that name. The last item for the head that I have to discuss is this dial indicator along with this 3D printed part. And you might be wondering what this is for. This is for checking your valve guide or valve shim clearance, because you want to make sure that your valve shims are the exact same clearance. If they're not, you're going to have an issue with throwing rockers. So originally there used to be an item you could purchase, which was a metal rod that was fitted to a stock style lifter that you could put into your head and go back and forth checking your valve shim clearance. They no longer sell that product, so I was left with no choice but to have my friend Goob 3D print me this tool and attach a dial indicator to it, which will work perfectly fine, I think. And I'm just going to use this to make sure my valve guide clearance is the same so I don't throw rockers, hopefully. So as you guys can see, there's a lot of pieces involved into rebuilding a motor, and because of that, I missed some things. One of the things that is really important that I want to discuss is this ARP piston ring compressor and installer. The reason I decided to buy this is because they are select fit for the piston size you are going with. In my case, it's 86.5 millimeters. And the reason I really like these is because the traditional piston ring compressor just basically clamps around a piston, you tighten it, and you hammer it into the cylinder and hope that the rings don't catch and snap. The reason I didn't want to risk using one of those onto this build is I have PVD coated rings and they're actually kind of more fragile in terms of bending. So rather than risking damaging or snapping a ring, I decided for the insurance, I purchased an ARP piston ring compressor. I also purchased brand new Nissan dowels that will go between the head and the block where the head studs go, and these are used to align the head onto the block. The reason I decided to get new ones is because they're cheap enough and because the old ones look pretty crusty. You could reuse your old ones. There's a lot of areas here that you could save money. You don't need a piston ring compressor. You don't need new dowels, but I decided to do that. And now moving on to the front cover and the oil pickup in the oil pump. I decided to purchase a brand new Nissan S14 S15 SR front cover, and the reason behind that is because it has a oil pump built into it. So not only am I replacing the front cover, I'm putting a brand new oil pump, which on my motor was probably 30 years old. And in addition to that, I also bought a new oil pickup tube, which will connect to the front cover on the oil pump and go into the oil pan to pick up the oil. The reason I decided to buy a new oil pickup tube is because I'm pretty sure my old one was really dirty and these screens like to get clogged, and rather than risking improperly cleaning it for the price of a new one, I decided for the insurance purposes I would just buy a new one. And I also purchased a new oil pump gear which will go on the crank and spin the oil pump. The reason I decided to purchase a new one of these is because my old one had a little bit of a flat spot from wearing out. So for the $5 that cost, I bought a new one. You guys can see a theme here that I'm just not taking any risk. So hopefully this motor lasts. One thing that I forgot to mention too is if you are purchasing a new front cover, or even if you're using your old front cover, you want to have this bolted onto the block when you have the block decked. And the reasoning behind that is if you don't have this bolted onto the block, then your block will be, after it's decked, lower than the front cover and the head won't seal properly and you will have compression issues. So make sure that when you're having your machine work done, you have this bolted onto the block. I'm pretty sure I went over this in a previous video because this was one of the first things I purchased for the rebuild. I decided to purchase a brand new Nissan gasket kit, which consists of every gasket that is required to reseal this motor. The only things that I'm not using from this gasket kit is the turbo to manifold gasket, because I decided to upgrade to a S15 one just because it is 7 layers and better at sealing. So I decided to run the S15 one. In this gasket kit, there is also the valve stem seals for both the exhaust and intake side, which will go into the head. And in addition to the Nissan gasket kit, I decided to purchase all new pipes that connect to the block because I'm pretty sure they'll be worn out after we remove them for the machine work, and I don't want to risk them being loose. So I decided to buy a brand new blow-by pipe that will go onto the block and have a tube that goes to the head. And I decided to buy a brand new dipstick tube, which will connect to the block. I also decided to purchase a brand new OEM Nissan timing chain kit, and the reason behind that is I'm pretty sure the chain on my motor was pretty stretched by this point. It's been drifted all its life. It's 30 years old. The motor came from Japan out of a drift car, so I'm pretty sure it's been abused forever. One thing that I also like about the new timing chain kits is they come with this guide right here. You will notice it's metal on one side and then this rubber plastic on the other side. The OEM guide when this motor was released was just plastic, and these are known to snap. So I decided to purchase a new kit. And then I decided to also use the OEM Nissan timing chain tensioner because, like I said, my chain that was on the motor was probably really stretched out. The issue with the MazWorks fixed tensioner is when you're using a brand new chain, you are setting that and it is not adjustable. And these chains like to stretch as they break in. So I don't want to use a MazWorks set tensioner yet, just because I do like the fact the hydraulic factory one does expand over time, and so the chain will have constant tension rather than having to check the chain tension. So once the chain is probably like 3-4 years old, I'll put a fixed tensioner on it, but for now I do want to run the OEM one. So the last item I'm going to be discussing in this video is the turbo I decided to go with. I know a lot of people are going to be like, oh, just put a G25 on it, that's the best turbo, blah blah blah. I am broke. I do not have money for a G25, although I wish I could. Hopefully one day I could buy the MazWorks G25 kit, but for now I'm sticking to a OEM S15 turbo. It's a brand new turbo. It's good. It'll be good enough for me for now. And the reason I decided to change the turbo is because I gave my old turbo to John thinking it was good, and that turbo was actually blown. So now me and John both need a turbo. But yeah, I got a brand new S15 turbo. It should be able to handle the power levels I'm looking to make, which is just stock. I like the idea of just having a new unit because the old one on my car was, again, 30 years old. So that is the last of the pieces. There are more things I purchased, but sadly I do not have them with me, such as a Tomei Japan oil pan. And I do want to purchase a ATI damper just because that is good insurance for your bearings. The more you could dampen the shock, especially when drifting for your bearings, the less wear it'll have. So I highly recommend purchasing that. But yeah, now I'm gonna go ahead and wrap all this up and drop it off to the machine shop. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys want to leave a comment about something you don't agree with, please do that. If you guys like the video, please let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next one, hopefully not in 3 to 6 months.